For decades he destroyed everything natural, but what no one expected was that an animal would be the one to save his life. And what happened next changed an entire community. If you love animals like I do, subscribe to the channel and watch all our stories. Marshall Thompson pressed the accelerator of his silver Mercedes G-Wagon, sending dust clouds swirling behind him as he navigated the dirt road that cut through his vast ranch in West Texas. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barren landscape he had carefully cultivated over 23 years. No wild horses galloping freely, no deer grazing in open meadows, no birds nesting in century-old trees, just endless rows of electric fencing, modern cattle pens, and the sterile efficiency that had made him the wealthiest landowner in Brewster County. The radio crackled with reports from his ranch foreman, Jake Sullivan, detailing the morning's operations. Another section of the old creek bed had been successfully drained and converted to grazing land. The last family of prairie dogs had been relocated far from the property boundaries. Everything was proceeding according to Marshall's vision of progress. At 52, Marshall Thompson embodied the ruthless efficiency that had transformed his inherited 3,000 acres into a 12,000-acre empire. His grandfather's modest cattle ranch had become a technological marvel of agricultural productivity. Every square foot served a purpose. Every blade of grass contributed to profit margins. There was no room for sentiment, no space for the wild, creatures that his grandfather had once cherished. Marshall's philosophy was simple. Nature needed management, control, direction. Left to its own devices, the land became chaotic, unprofitable, wasteful. Wild animals were nothing more than pests that consumed resources meant for livestock. They carried diseases, damaged equipment, and frightened the cattle. His father had been too soft, too willing to coexist with the indigenous wildlife. Marshall had corrected that weakness within his first year of inheriting the property. The BC transformation hadn't been without resistance. Several longtime ranch hands had quit when Marshall began installing the electric fencing system that now surrounded every water source for miles. The local community had protested when he purchased and enclosed the traditional migration routes used by wild horses for generations. Environmental groups had filed lawsuits when he drained the natural wetlands that had served as nesting grounds for migratory birds. But Marshall had prevailed in every legal battle. His lawyers were the best money could buy. His political connections ran deep through Austin and Washington. His charitable donations to local schools and hospitals had earned him grudging respect from most of the community, even from those who disagreed with his methods. This morning's drive was routine. Marshall made this circuit 3 times a week, inspecting fence lines, checking cattle counts, and ensuring that his investment remained secure and productive. He had scheduled a meeting with potential investors from Dallas who were interested in his revolutionary ranching techniques. The presentation would showcase how traditional sentiment about wildlife preservation was simply incompatible with modern agricultural success. The road curved sharply around a small hill where his grandfather had once maintained a grove of mesquite trees. Marshall had cleared those trees 5 years ago, citing fire safety concerns. The area now hosted a state-of-the-art cattle watering system that could service 300 head simultaneously. As he rounded the curve, Marshall's attention was momentarily caught by movement in his peripheral vision. Something large had shifted in the brush beyond the fence line. He dismissed it immediately, probably just one of his own cattle that had wandered closer to the boundary than usual. His phone buzzed with a text message from Jake Sullivan. The new investors had arrived early and were waiting at the main house. Marshall pressed harder on the accelerator, eager to close another lucrative deal that would fund the next phase of expansion. He had his eye on the Henderson property to the south, a quaint but inefficient operation run by an elderly widow who still allowed wild animals to roam freely across her land. The dirt road straightened as it descended toward the valley floor. Marshall had traveled this route thousands of times without incident. He knew every bump, every washout, every seasonal challenge, which made what happened next even more inexplicable. A massive branch, easily 8 feet long and thick as a man's torso, lay directly across the road ahead. Marshall had driven this exact route just 3 days earlier. There had been no dead trees, no wind damage, no signs of potential obstacles. The branch appeared to have materialized from nowhere. Marshall yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, attempting to swerve around the unexpected barrier. The heavy SUV responded sluggishly on the loose gravel surface. The rear wheels lost traction first, sending the vehicle into a sideways slide. Marshall overcorrected, jerking the wheel back to the left. The Mercedes tilted precariously as it left the road surface, tires struggling for purchase on the steep embankment. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the SUV balanced on 2 wheels. Then gravity claimed its victory. The vehicle rolled twice before slamming into the bottom of a shallow ravine with a sound like thunder. The impact drove Marshall's head into the side window. Warm liquid ran down his temple as he hung suspended by his seatbelt, the SUV now resting on its passenger side. Silence settled over the accident scene like a heavy blanket. Marshall's ears rang from the impact. His left shoulder throbbed where the seatbelt had caught him during the rollover. The taste of copper filled his mouth. But he was conscious and nothing seemed to be broken. The driver's side door, now positioned above him, was crumpled beyond any hope of opening. The passenger door was buried partially in the dirt. The windshield had spider-webbed but remained intact. Marshall reached for his phone, knowing even as he did so that cell service was non-existent in this remote section of the ranch. He tried calling out for help, but his voice barely carried beyond the confines of the damaged vehicle. This section of road saw virtually no traffic. Jake Sullivan wouldn't expect him back for at least 2 hours. The investors would assume he had been delayed by routine ranch business. Marshall closed his eyes and attempted to assess his situation rationally. He was injured but mobile. The SUV was damaged but not completely destroyed. Someone would eventually notice his absence and organize a search. It was simply a matter of remaining calm and conserving energy until rescue arrived. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The Texas sun climbed higher, and the interior of the overturned vehicle began to heat up significantly. Marshall's throat grew dry. His head wound had stopped bleeding, but the pain was intensifying. That's when he heard it, the soft sound of hoofbeats on rocky ground. Marshall opened his eyes and looked through the shattered windshield. A horse stood at the edge of the ravine, looking down at the accident scene, not one of his cattle horses from the main stable. This animal was different, larger, wilder. Its coat was the color of burnished copper, and its mane flowed freely in the morning breeze. Most striking was the scar that marked the horse's left flank, a long straight line that looked disturbingly like a brand mark, though Marshall couldn't make out any specific design from his current position. The horse descended carefully into the ravine, moving with the sure-footed confidence of an animal completely at home in rough terrain. It approached the overturned SUV without fear, without hesitation, as if investigating accident scenes was part of its daily routine. Marshall found himself staring into the horse's eyes. They were dark brown, almost black, and held an intelligence that seemed almost human. The animal studied him for several long moments, then turned and walked back up the ravine slope with purposeful strides. Marshall watched the horse disappear over the rim of the ravine, leaving him alone with the growing heat and his mounting anxiety. He told himself that the encounter meant nothing. Wild horses occasionally wandered onto his property despite the electric fencing. They were nuisances, nothing more. The animal had probably been attracted by the noise of the crash and had satisfied its curiosity. 40 minutes stretched into an hour. The sun climbed higher, and the interior of the overturned Mercedes became stifling. Marshall's water bottle had spilled during the rollover, leaving him with nothing to drink. His head throbbed with increasing intensity, and he began to wonder if the injury was more serious than he had initially believed. He tried again to force open the passenger door, pushing against it with his feet while bracing himself with his arms. The door moved slightly but remained stubbornly stuck in the dirt and debris. Marshall's strength was beginning to fade, and panic started creeping into his thoughts. That's when he heard the hoofbeats returning. The copper-colored horse reappeared at the edge of the ravine, but this time it wasn't alone. Something dark dangled from its mouth. As the animal carefully picked its way down the slope, Marshall could see that it carried a piece of red fabric, torn and weathered, but unmistakably part of a work shirt. The horse approached the SUV again, dropping the cloth near the vehicle before retreating several yards. It stood motionless, watching Marshall with those unsettling, intelligent eyes. Then it turned and climbed back up the ravine slope, disappearing once more into the brush. Marshall stared at the red fabric, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. Horses didn't rescue people. They didn't carry items to accident scenes. They certainly didn't exhibit the kind of purposeful behavior he had just observed. Yet the evidence lay right outside his window. 15 minutes later, Marshall heard voices calling his name from somewhere above the ravine. Relief flooded through him as he recognized the voice of Pete Martinez, one of his longest-serving ranch hands. Marshall called back as loudly as his parched throat would allow. Pete's weathered face appeared at the rim of the ravine, followed by two other men Marshall didn't immediately recognize. Within minutes, they had rappelled down into the ravine using ropes from Pete's truck. The rescue was efficient and professional. They stabilized Marshall's neck, checked for serious injuries, and carefully extracted him from the overturned vehicle. As they prepared to lift him out of the ravine, Marshall grabbed Pete's arm. "How did you find me?" "I didn't expect anyone to come looking for hours." Pete looked puzzled. "Tommy Garrison flagged us down on County Road 12, said someone needed help out here. He was pretty insistent about it, kept pointing toward this section of your property. Weird thing is, Tommy was holding this torn piece of red shirt, said he found it on his fence line about an hour ago." Marshall felt a chill run down his spine despite the heat. Tommy Garrison owned a small spread about 3 miles to the east. There was no logical way the red cloth could have traveled from this accident scene to Tommy's property in the time the horse had been gone. At Brewster County Regional Hospital, Marshall underwent a thorough examination. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, determined that he had suffered a mild concussion and some bruised ribs, but nothing that required hospitalization. She recommended rest and observation for 24 hours. Marshall's nurse was a young woman named Sarah Mitchell, with kind eyes and gentle hands that spoke of natural compassion. She seemed familiar, though Marshall couldn't place where he might have met her. As she checked his vital signs and applied fresh bandages to his head wound, Sarah mentioned that she had grown up on a ranch not far from his property. "My father used to work for your family," Sarah said quietly as she recorded. "His blood pressure, Danny Mitchell. He was your head wrangler for almost 15 years until about 8 years ago." Marshall remembered Danny Mitchell, a skilled horseman who had objected vocally to Marshall's modernization plans, particularly the installation of the electric fencing system that had eliminated the traditional grazing areas used by wild horses. Danny had quit in protest when Marshall refused to maintain corridors for wildlife movement. Marshall had considered him sentimental and impractical. "I remember your father," Marshall said carefully. "Good man, but we had different philosophies about ranch management." Sarah nodded, her expression neutral. "Dad always said this land had its own way of taking care of things. He used to tell stories about a wild stallion that had been roaming these parts for years. Said the horse had a scar on its left side like someone had tried to brand it once but didn't finish the job." Marshall's attention sharpened. "Your father talked about this horse?" "All the time. Dad claimed the horse had saved his life once, back when he was working for your grandfather. A flash flood caught him in one of the creek beds, and his own. Horse panicked and ran off. Dad said this wild stallion appeared out of nowhere and led him to higher ground. Sounds crazy, I know, but Dad swore it was true." Marshall lay back against the hospital pillows, his mind racing. The horse he had encountered matched Sarah's description perfectly. The copper coat, the intelligence in its eyes, and most notably, the distinctive scar on its left flank. "Did your father ever mention anything about this horse helping other people?" Sarah glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Dad used to say the horse showed up whenever someone was in real trouble out there. Never hurt anybody, never got too close to people, but somehow always seemed to know when help was needed. The old-timers had stories going back generations." Marshall had always dismissed such tales as the superstitious nonsense of uneducated ranch hands. Now he wasn't so sure. The sequence of events that had led to his rescue was too precise, too orchestrated to be mere coincidence. That evening, alone in his hospital room, Marshall found himself reliving every moment of his encounter with the mysterious horse. He tried to rationalize what had happened, to find logical explanations for the animal's behavior. But deep down, he knew he had experienced something that defied rational explanation. Sleep came fitfully, filled with vivid dreams that seemed more real than memory. In one dream, Marshall was running. Across open prairie, his hooves pounding against the earth as wind whipped through his mane. He could feel the freedom of unrestricted movement, the joy of galloping without barriers or boundaries. In another dream, he was a child again, standing in his grandfather's barn with a bucket of oats in his small hands. A young colt with a copper coat nuzzled his palm, seeking treats. His grandfather's voice echoed through the dream. "Some animals got souls just like people, Marshall. You treat them with respect, and they'll surprise you every time." Marshall woke with tears on his cheeks, memories flooding back that he had spent decades trying to forget. His grandfather had indeed kept wild horses on the property, had maintained water sources specifically for wildlife, had believed in coexistence rather than domination. It was Marshall's father who had begun the transition to modern ranching methods, and Marshall himself who had completed the transformation into the sterile efficiency that now characterized Thompson Ranch. When Sarah Mitchell brought his breakfast, the next morning, Marshall surprised himself by asking about her father's current situation. Sarah explained that Danny now worked for a small conservation group, helping to establish wildlife corridors on private ranch land throughout West Texas. "He's been trying to get ranchers to leave small sections of their property unfenced," Sarah said. "Nothing that would hurt their operations, just enough space for animals to move between water sources. It's been a hard sell. Most owners think it's a waste of valuable grazing land." Marshall nodded thoughtfully. For the first time in decades, he found himself questioning the absolute certainty that had driven his business decisions. The encounter with the horse had shaken something loose inside him, something he had thought was permanently buried. As Sarah prepared to discharge him from the hospital, Marshall made an impulsive decision. "Would you give your father a message for me? Tell him Marshall Thompson would like to have a conversation about wildlife corridors." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? After all these years?" Marshall looked out the hospital window toward the distant hills that marked the boundaries of his property. Somewhere out there, a copper-colored horse with ancient wisdom in its eyes was probably watching over other travelers in trouble. "Really," Marshall said. "It's time I learned some things I should have paid attention to years ago." Marshall returned to Thompson Ranch 3 days later, his head still tender from the accident, but his perspective fundamentally altered. The familiar sight of endless electric fencing and sterile efficiency that had once filled him with pride now generated an unexpected feeling of unease. For the first time in decades, he found himself looking at his property through different eyes. Jake Sullivan met him at the main house with a clipboard full of urgent matters requiring immediate attention. The investors from Dallas had rescheduled their visit for the following week. The new cattle shipment from Montana had arrived ahead of schedule. 3 sections of the electric fence along the eastern boundary had mysteriously malfunctioned and needed expensive repairs. "Probably just weather damage," Jake explained, his tone suggesting this was merely another routine maintenance issue. "I've already contacted the electrical contractor. Should have everything fixed within 48 hours. Marshall nodded absently, his attention drawn to movement beyond the fence line. A small herd of deer had gathered near what had once been a natural spring, now diverted into the ranch's irrigation system. The animals stood at the fence boundary, unable to reach the water that had sustained their ancestors for generations. "Jake, why did we fence off the old spring?" Jake looked surprised by the question. "Disease prevention, sir. Wild animals carry parasites that can contaminate water sources. We discussed this extensively when we implemented the modernization program." Marshall remembered the discussion, but now found himself questioning the assumptions that had driven those decisions. Have we actually documented any disease transmission from wildlife to our cattle? "Well, no, sir, but prevention is always preferable to treatment. Besides, the water allocation is much more efficient now that we control the flow completely. Marshall walked to the window overlooking the eastern pasture. The landscape was undeniably productive and well managed. Every acre served its purpose, in the carefully orchestrated symphony of modern ranching. Yet something essential seemed to be missing, something he had never noticed until now. Over the following weeks, Marshall began making small changes that puzzled his staff and deeply concerned Jake Sullivan. He ordered the removal of several sections of electric fencing along traditional wildlife corridors. He instructed the ranch hands to stop using the sonic devices that had been installed to discourage wild animals from approaching water sources. Most significantly, Marshall cancelled the expansion project that would have converted the last undeveloped section of the ranch into additional grazing land. This area, known locally as Devil's Canyon, contained rugged terrain that had never been suitable for cattle operations anyway. But the geological survey had indicated valuable mineral deposits that could be extracted through careful mining operations. Jake Sullivan requested a private meeting to discuss these developments. They sat in Marshall's office, surrounded by awards and photographs celebrating decades of agricultural innovation and business success. Jake's expression was carefully controlled, but Marshall could sense the frustration beneath his professional demeanor. "Marshall, I have to ask if your accident might have affected your judgment more than the doctors realized," Jake began cautiously. "The decisions you've been making lately don't align with our long-term strategic planning. The investors are asking questions. The bank is concerned about the cancelled expansion project." Marshall studied his ranch foreman carefully. Jake had worked for him for 12 years, rising from a junior supervisor to the second most powerful position on the ranch. He was efficient, ruthless when necessary, and completely devoted to maximizing profit margins. All qualities that Marshall had previously valued above all others. "My judgment is fine, Jake. I'm simply reconsidering some of our operational priorities. Sir, with respect, allowing wild animals back onto the property is going to create problems. They'll compete with our cattle for resources. They'll damage equipment. They'll complicate our disease prevention protocols." Marshall leaned back in his chair, remembering his conversation with Sarah Mitchell and the stories her father had told about coexistence between livestock and wildlife. "Have you ever considered that there might be benefits to maintaining some wildlife habitat on the property?" Jake's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Benefits? Sir, every acre we're not using efficiently is money lost. The competition in the ranching industry is fierce. We can't afford to waste resources on sentimental environmental concerns." That evening, Marshall drove out to Devil's Canyon alone, following dirt tracks that hadn't been used for regular ranch operations in years. The canyon was a hidden gem on his property, featuring natural rock formations, a year-round stream, and vegetation that had somehow survived the modernization. Efforts applied to the rest of the ranch. As he walked along the stream bank, Marshall noticed fresh hoof prints in the soft mud. Not from cattle, which had been excluded from this area for over a decade. These were the prints of unshod horses, wild animals that had somehow found their way past his security measures. The realization filled him with an emotion he hadn't experienced in years, excitement rather than irritation at discovering wildlife on his property. Over the following month, Marshall continued to modify ranch operations in ways that created space for natural wildlife behaviors. He installed traditional water troughs alongside several fence lines, allowing animals from both sides to access clean water. He ordered the removal of the sonic deterrent devices that had made the ranch a no-fly zone for most bird species. The changes produced immediate results. Within 2 weeks, deer began appearing regularly in the eastern pastures. A family of foxes took up residence near the main barn, seemingly uninterested in the cattle operations happening around them. Most remarkably, birds began returning to areas that had been silent for years. But the most significant visitor remained elusive. Marshall caught occasional glimpses of the copper-colored horse with the scarred flank, always at a distance, always watching. The animal seemed to approve of the changes taking place, but maintained its mysterious aloofness. Jake Sullivan's opposition to these modifications became increasingly vocal. He began documenting every instance of wildlife interaction with ranch operations, building a case that the new policies were creating operational inefficiencies and potential liability issues. "We've had 3 different incidents this month of deer interfering with cattle roundups," Jake reported during their weekly staff meeting. "The foxes have been getting into the grain storage areas, and those wild horses you're allowing onto the property are spooking our working horses during training exercises." Marshall listened patiently to Jake's concerns, but found himself unmoved by arguments that had once seemed compelling. "Any actual damage or financial loss?" "Well, no, sir, but the potential for problems is significant. And the men are starting to talk. They don't understand why we're changing policies that have worked effectively for years." Marshall dismissed the meeting early and drove out to check the fence repairs in the eastern section. What he discovered there made his blood run cold. Someone had reinstalled electric wiring along portions of the fence he had specifically ordered to be left open. Worse, they had installed it at a height that would be particularly dangerous to animals attempting to cross the boundary. When he confronted Jake about the unauthorized repairs, his ranch foreman claimed it had been a miscommunication with the electrical contractor, but Marshall had noticed the invoices for the work had been deliberately buried in routine maintenance reports, suggesting an intentional attempt to conceal the installation. That night, Marshall received an unexpected phone call from Tommy Garrison, the neighboring rancher, who had played a role in his rescue after the accident. Tommy's voice was tense with concern. "Marshall, I hate to bother you, but I thought you should know. I found 3 horses tangled up in electric wire along our shared boundary. Looks like they got caught trying to cross from your property to mine. They're hurt pretty bad, but they'll survive. Thing is, that wire wasn't there when I checked the fence line 2 days ago." Marshall drove out to investigate immediately, his worst fears confirmed when he saw the evidence of the horses' struggle with the newly installed electric fencing. The wire had been positioned to create a trap rather than a simple deterrent, suggesting deliberate intent to harm rather than merely discourage wildlife movement. One of the injured horses was a young mare with a distinctive white blaze on her forehead. But it was the second horse that made Marshall's heart stop. The copper-colored stallion with the scarred flank stood nearby, watching over his injured companions. For the first time since the accident, the mysterious horse allowed Marshall to approach within a few yards. The stallion's eyes held no accusation, no anger, but rather a profound sadness that seemed to penetrate straight through to Marshall's soul. In that moment, Marshall understood that this wasn't just about wildlife management or ranch operations. This was about the fundamental question of what kind of man he chose to be. As Marshall called the veterinarian to treat the injured horses, he made a decision that would change everything. It was time to discover exactly who on his ranch was working against his efforts to restore balance to the land, and why they were willing to harm innocent animals to maintain the old ways of doing business. The veterinarian arrived within an hour, a skilled woman named Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who had been treating ranch animals in Brewster County for over 20 years. As she worked to tend the injured horses, she shared observations that troubled Marshall deeply. "These wire placements weren't accidental," Dr. Rodriguez explained while cleaning the wounds on the young mare. "Someone with knowledge of horse behavior deliberately positioned this fencing to create maximum harm. The height, the tension, the location. This was designed to injure any animal attempting to cross." Marshall stood beside the copper-colored stallion, who had remained calm throughout the veterinary treatment of his companions. The horse's presence had a strangely calming effect on the injured animals, and even Dr. Rodriguez commented on the unusual behavior. "I've never seen a wild horse stay so close during medical treatment," she mused. "It's almost like he understands that we're helping them." As dawn broke over Thompson Ranch, Marshall made a decision that would expose the truth behind the sabotage. He called an emergency meeting of all ranch staff and announced that he was installing security cameras throughout the property, ostensibly to prevent further accidents with wildlife. Jake Sullivan's reaction was swift and revealing. Within hours of the announcement, Marshall received a phone call from the Dallas investors, expressing concern about the direction of ranch operations and threatening to withdraw their funding for future expansion projects. Marshall realized that Jake had been feeding information to outside parties, probably painting Marshall's new wildlife policies as signs of diminished mental capacity following his accident. The implications were staggering. Jake wasn't just resisting change. He was actively working to have Marshall declared unfit to manage his own property. That evening, Marshall drove out to Devil's Canyon with a specific purpose. He parked his truck near the stream and walked to a spot where he had noticed fresh hoofprints during his previous visits. As the sun set behind the canyon walls, the copper-colored stallion emerged from the brush, approaching closer than ever before. For the first time, Marshall was able to examine the distinctive scar on the horse's flank clearly. It wasn't a failed branding mark as he had assumed. The scar formed a clear pattern, the initials MT surrounded by a circle. Marshall Thompson's grandfather's, mark, applied to special horses that were never intended for sale. Understanding flooded through Marshall like a physical shock. This wasn't just any wild horse. This was a descendant of his grandfather's prized breeding stock, animals that had been given free run of the property for generations. The electric fencing and modernization projects hadn't just displaced random wildlife. They had destroyed a legacy that stretched back to the founding of Thompson Ranch. Marshall pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 8 years. Danny Mitchell answered on the second ring, his voice cautious but not unfriendly. "Danny, it's Marshall Thompson. I need to ask you about something my grandfather did with his horses." There was a long pause before Danny responded. "What do you want to know?" "The wild horses that used to roam this property, were they descended from grandfather's breeding program?" Danny's voice softened. "Your grandfather believed that some horses were too special to be owned by any one person. He marked his best stallions and mares with his brand, then turned them loose to live free on the land. Said they'd earned the right to choose their own path." Marshall closed his eyes, remembering childhood visits to the ranch when wild horses could still be seen grazing alongside cattle, sharing water sources, and moving freely across the landscape. "What happened to them after grandfather passed away?" "Your father tolerated them, but you saw them as competition for resources. Most of the bloodline scattered to other properties when you started installing the electric fencing. But a few stayed, trying to maintain the traditional routes between water sources." Marshall looked at the stallion standing patiently nearby. "One of them saved my life a few weeks ago." Danny was quiet for several moments. "That horse has been protecting people on this land for years, Marshall. He saved at least 3 others that I know of personally. Your grandfather always said the land would take care of those who took care of it." The next morning, Marshall called Jake Sullivan into his office for what he knew would be their final conversation as employer and employee. He had spent the night reviewing financial records and discovering a pattern of unauthorized decisions made in his name, contracts signed without his knowledge, and communications with outside parties about his supposed mental incompetence. "Jake, we need to discuss your future with Thompson Ranch." Jake's expression remained neutral, but Marshall could see the calculation behind his eyes. "What aspects of my performance are concerning you, sir?" Marshall placed a folder on the desk between them. "The unauthorized reinstallation of electric fencing, the communications with investors about my mental state, the deliberate sabotage of wildlife corridor initiatives." Jake's professional mask slipped slightly. "Marshall, you've been making decisions that threaten the financial stability of this operation. Someone has to think about the long-term viability of the business." "Someone? Or you and the investment group that's been pressuring me to expand operations into Devil's Canyon?" Jake's silence confirmed Marshall's suspicions. The ranch foreman had been working with outside interests to push Marshall toward more aggressive development of the property, with the ultimate goal of gaining control of operations when Marshall was declared unfit. "Your services are no longer required, Jake. I'll expect your resignation letter and your departure from ranch property by the end of the week." Jake stood slowly, his expression hardening into something approaching hatred. "You're making a mistake, Marshall. This ranch won't survive your sentimental attachment to worthless animals. The investors won't tolerate this kind of mismanagement indefinitely. After Jake left, Marshall called Sarah Mitchell at the hospital and asked if her father would be willing to meet with him about establishing a permanent wildlife preserve on Thompson Ranch. The conversation that followed would change the direction of his life completely. 3 months later, Marshall stood before a gathering of local ranchers, environmentalists, and community leaders to announce the establishment of the Thompson Ranch Wildlife Sanctuary. 5,000 acres of his property would be permanently protected as habitat for indigenous wildlife, with traditional water sources restored and maintained, specifically for wild animals. The ceremony took place in Devil's Canyon, with a simple plaque marking the dedication of the preserve to the memory of Marshall's grandfather and his belief in coexistence between human enterprise and natural wildlife. As the crowd dispersed after the ceremony, Marshall noticed a familiar figure watching from the canyon rim. The copper-colored stallion stood silhouetted against the sky, no longer elusive or distant. For the first time since his accident, the horse approached close enough for Marshall to extend his hand. The stallion allowed Marshall to touch his neck briefly, a gesture of acceptance that seemed to close a circle of understanding that had been decades in the making. Then the horse turned and walked away, not fleeing but simply returning to his domain with the quiet dignity of a creature, finally at peace. Danny Mitchell joined Marshall as they watched the stallion disappear into the canyon. "Your grandfather would be proud of what you've done here." Marshall nodded, feeling a sense of completion he hadn't experienced since childhood. "I spent 20 years trying to control this land. Turns out what it really needed was someone willing to share it." That evening, Marshall received an unexpected visitor. Old Tom Riverside, a ranch hand who had worked for 3 generations of Thompsons and had recently been dismissed by Jake Sullivan for inefficiency, stood at the front door with his hat in his hands. Tom had been born mute, but his understanding of horses and wildlife was legendary among the ranch community. Through written notes and gestures, Tom revealed the final piece of the puzzle. He had been secretly maintaining water sources and safe passages for wildlife throughout Jake's tenure, working at night to undo damage done during the day. More importantly, Tom had been the one feeding information to Tommy Garrison about Marshall's accident location, guided by the copper-colored stallion who had appeared at Tom's cabin immediately after the crash. The horse had somehow communicated the location and urgency of Marshall's situation to the one person on the ranch who still understood the old ways of listening to the land. Marshall offered Tom a permanent position as sanctuary caretaker, a role that would allow him to continue his unofficial work of protecting the wild creatures that now had an official home on Thompson Ranch. 6 months after the sanctuary dedication, Marshall received news that the Dallas Investment Group had withdrawn all financial backing from ranch operations, citing his unstable management decisions. Rather than feeling concern, Marshall experienced profound relief. The sanctuary was financially self-sustaining through ecotourism and educational programs, and the remaining cattle operations were more profitable than ever due to improved grass management and reduced infrastructure costs. Most importantly, Marshall had discovered a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since childhood. Each morning he walked the sanctuary trails, observing the return of wildlife species that hadn't been seen on the property for decades. Birds nested in restored habitat areas, deer grazed peacefully alongside cattle, and occasionally, in the early morning mist, he caught glimpses of the copper-colored stallion watching over his domain with the wisdom of ages. The transformation of Thompson Ranch from sterile efficiency to balanced coexistence had taken less than a year to accomplish. But the internal transformation of Marshall Thompson himself would continue for the rest of his life. He had learned that true ownership didn't mean control over the land, but rather stewardship of the sacred trust between human ambition and natural wisdom. As he stood in Devil's Canyon on the anniversary of the sanctuary dedication, Marshall reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment of peace. A chance encounter with a mysterious horse had saved more than his life. It had saved his soul from the emptiness of a world without wonder. The stallion appeared one final time as the sun set behind the canyon walls, approaching closer than ever before. For a moment that seemed to exist outside of time itself, man and horse stood together in perfect understanding of the bond that connected all living things to the land that sustained them. Then the stallion turned and walked away into the gathering darkness, his work finally complete.